Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Tonic Accord podcast. I'm your host or co-host, Drew, joined by my friend and co-host, Alex. How you doing, man?
Not too bad. Not too bad. I'm letting the beard continue to grow.
Nice.
Just trying to stay sane. Applications and life. I don't know. How about you, man?
Good. I'm doing all right. I'm staying busy with my political media work. But I'm excited about this episode because I know so little about what we're talking about. And that's kind of one of the things that Alex and I wanted to do with this podcast was, make sure that pretty often we touch on things that don't get a lot of news, don't make the 24-hour Trump headline or whatever. And I did see on some of the political subreddits I follow on Reddit, as well as a little bit of waves in the news, but not much, about what's going on in Western Togoland, or in the country of Ghana, but in the region that is called Western Togoland, especially I think it's called not Volga, that's Russian.
Is the Volta?
Volta, there it is, the Volta region. And so what's going on there is just at the end of September, a separatist movement called the Homeland Study Group Foundation, an interesting name, I think. I think of a study group for like 5 kids before a final in college. But the Homeland Study Group Foundation is a separate. I know, a little goofy. It's a separatist movement though in Western Togoland, and they declared their independence. Now, it's not necessarily officially recognized, and they've done this before. They did this probably early 2010s, and there's a history here. And so when I saw I just saw that headline of Western Togoland declares its independence from Ghana, and I was like, what? That's crazy. That's a whole new country to the world, supposedly. And so that's what allowed us to. That's what kind of drove me to dive in and learn a little bit more. So we're going to take a look at Western Togoland, what's going on in that region of Africa, and kind of why it's happening, and maybe just kind of get a little education on something that perhaps definitely me, but perhaps you listening at home haven't really learned much about. So So what? I mean, did you know much about this region, or had heard anything about this on your end, Alex?
The short answer, no, definitely not, because it's kind of funny when I think it was yesterday when we were talking about ideas for this episode, you mentioned Togoland, and I automatically thought of the country Togo, which is right next to Ghana. Right. So for the first part of researching for this, I was looking at Togo, right? And so I did a bunch of research on Togo because I'm assuming Togoland, Togo, right? Turns out, no, these are just old colonial borders, and there's all these differences of allegiance and cultural and ethnic identities going on at the same time. And it's kind of funny you brought this up, though, because I think 3 days ago we had a power outage up here in Northern California. I'm assuming linked to kind of the rolling blackouts with the fires.
Yeah.
And one night I decided to start reading the Economist section on Africa. And they were talking about Ghana being one of the most one of the most gold-rich countries in the world. And during the colonial and imperial part, Ghana was a country that the Portuguese created almost an empire out of. It was bringing gold from the New World to Ghana, but also getting gold from Ghana into Portugal. So Ghana was almost this double-edged, just like success. And so I thought it was interesting that as I realized that Togoland is not in Togo, I thought it was interesting to hear about this, separatist independence movement. And I think around the world in general, we need to remember that there's a lot of countries that don't connect with the country that they're subscribed to, right. Especially in Africa. The Berlin Conference at the end of the 19th century was a European-led effort to draw up borders in Africa. And to this day, we still see ethnic groups that don't particularly align with the country that they're in. And I actually went on to Britannica, if you deal with me for another minute here, I went on to Britannica just to give a little background of Ghana itself. It's actually one of the leading countries of Africa because of its mineral wealth. And because actually it's the first Black African country south of the Sahara to achieve independence from colonial rule. So interestingly enough, this is a country that is super, I would say, politically active. It almost kind of has an identity that exists as a nation more than just ethnic groups. And I think I do want to get back to that later. But that's a key thing to remember, is that Ghana has actually been a moderately successful country in that region in terms of political activism and in economics. And so when you talk about, this independence movement coming out of Togoland, which was a German colony starting in I think the 1800s, I question efficacy of it, because that Ghana is going to want to fight back, because this is a country that has been unified and quite active and economically successful.
Yeah, that's the vibe that I got from looking at various opinions, and looking at the history of Ghana. Because of course the first thing I ask myself is, okay, there's people in this region of what they call Western Togoland, and they want to be rid of Ghana. Why, right? Why do they want their independence? And it seems like that this goes back to those when the borders were drawn, and when a referendum happened. So I want to talk about a little history, right? It was actually under a mandate of the League of Nations that the German colony, of Togoland, right, was partitioned between France and the British in 1922. So it was a German colony. World War I ended. So Germany had to kind of give up a lot of stuff. And so the French and British, through the League of Nations, partitioned that area. But the League of Nations is no longer a thing. It's not a real organization anymore. The United Nations is what succeeded the League of Nations. And so that kind of political control over those regions and that border drawing was then transferred to the UN. And it was in 1956 that the UN organized what they called a plebiscite or a referendum. I'll be honest, I had to look that word up. But it was a referendum for all the people of that region, of Western Togoland, to vote on whether to be independent or to join the people of the Gold Coast colony, the Anlos, the Fanti Confederation, to form a new united country of Ghana. And at the time, the majority of the votes, there was I think it was over 100, a little bit over 100,000 people did the vote. 30,000 said, I don't even know what I'm voting on. And it was a small majority that did end up wanting to join the Gold Coast colony of Ghana. And so a lot of the contention comes from that referendum, that plebiscite, that we still see today. So the people today in Western Togoland that are wanting to separate, they claim that there was European, there's too much European and British influence in that plebiscite, and that they were fudging the numbers. And like I said, there were people that didn't even know what they were even voting on, right? They had, barely understood what the consequences and the context of this grand referendum was really doing. So they say, it should be defunct, it should be ignored, we can't trust those numbers. Then there's people that, especially people of Ghana, and then even people in Togoland that want to stay part of Ghana, they say, look, we already voted on this 50, 60 years ago. We already decided to become part of Ghana, and we're better off for it. So that's kind of where that division lies. Is it does go back to the UN's involvement in that plebiscite in the 50s. And I'm sure you can agree with me it's crazy to see how many of these ethnic and border conflicts are derived from European involvement 50, 60 years ago.
Yeah, and definitely that. And one thing I was thinking about while you were talking about that is that, you and I have talked about Greece and Turkey recently, right? We've talked about Azerbaijan and Armenia, and there's ironically, not even ironically, there's sadly a similarity between all of these conflicts that we're seeing kind of escalate. And it's that I'm looking here at Britannica's just background, kind of what you were talking about. They were a German protectorate till 1914, but now it's saying Togoland was part of the nation of Togo, which is now part of Ghana. And I feel like that is part of the criteria of a region that wants conflict. They were part of a historically different place, and now they're part of a different place than their historic homeland, right? Like it seems to always be the case. Like Armenia, right? There's that region in Azerbaijan that is Armenian, and historically was part of Armenia, right? Like, and I see the same thing in a lot of these parts of Africa, is that these borders that were drawn up just really lacked any understanding, and that's sadly what we're seeing now. But now the reality is that we're seeing, well, we're seeing that the government of Ghana is trying to suppress this, I guess, rebellion, independence movement, whatever you want to call it. They're trying to suppress it with any means possible. And I'm particularly wondering still to this day, why are they trying to do this? Because Togo, which is the other country near them, has had like 60 years of authoritarian dictatorship, violence, suppression of free speech. And Ghana's kind of, I don't want to say a beacon of hope, but they're definitely doing better than Togo. So I just really wonder, like, what is the end goal here? And I guess before it gets into the weeds, I do want to go down to Center for Strategic and International Studies has a great piece, which I'll put the link in the bio, because it's actually a really good discussion on how a state should declare independence and when it's successful. Basically, it looks at a lot of the independence movements over the last 100 years. It says that especially Americans consider independence movements as a rosy thing because we were an unlikely triumph with the American Revolution, right? Like, but their point is that it didn't involve religious and cultural divides, and so they use these 4 rules here kind of to talk about it, and they say, one, international environment. Is a place like Togoland going to be internationally accepted? And I would say no, because Ghana already has declared them something that they need to suppress. And they use the example of actually Eritrea, which was part of Ethiopia for a long time. And interestingly enough, and this is something I learned today, Ethiopia was actually supportive of the Eritrean independence. And so it allowed kind of, I would say, what's it, the Eastern Horn of Africa to be somewhat accepting of a new country. So that's one of the steps is international, cooperation. It happened also during the breakup of Yugoslavia, right?
Right.
Like, Yugoslavia wouldn't have broken up if the international community was like, hell no. But now the thing is, with this Ghana thing, I don't really think anyone knows about this. Like, I was digging deep to find information on this. Like, no one talks about it. So, but then the other criteria they have are regional environment. And that goes into also the Ethiopia thing. But the interesting one, economic context. Yes. And they use the example of South Sudan in this, is that obviously we have seen hundreds of millions of injured, violence in Sudan, and millions of deaths, right? This was a just humanitarian crisis, including Darfur and kind of that whole crisis leading into even the 2010s. But when South Sudan separated from Sudan, they actually saw even bigger violence. And that was because there were no economic parameters in place. They were lacking workers. They were lacking an educated population. They were lacking the actual education infrastructure. And so they thought, and actually this is an interesting thing too, is that South Sudan has the mass amount of oil in Sudan. They had no access to pipelines because Sudan owns all the pipelines. So even though South Sudan has all the oil, they realized that once they, separated from Sudan, they're pretty much a fish out of water. And so basically, like I'm saying a lot of things right now, but this Center for Strategic and International Studies paper basically says that it's really hard to actually get good independence and successful independence. And yeah, like I think the same thing's happening here because this group out of Togoland is committing acts of violence against Ghanese citizens.
Right. And I think the economic aspect is big. Like you had mentioned, like, because you're right. Like what? Okay, like it's like the what next thing, right? Okay, so if you get independence, what next? Because from what I gathered, and again, we talked a little bit about it, is there's really not that much like modern information on this area. Like you don't find a lot of BBC or Economist articles. You kind of have to dig, and it's certainly not on the CNN headlines or anything. So I had to kind of dig, but from what I understood and reading, posts by people from Togoland and Ghana, is that this region in Ghana, Western Togoland, is not doing particularly well, which might also play into why some people feel they want to separate as well, right? They maybe feel disenfranchised, but it looks like it's one of the poorer parts of Ghana. But then again, like you say, okay, so let's say you have independence, then now you're independent, and your economy sucks. So it's like, how do you build that from the ground up? Are you going to get help from Togo? Because like you said, Togo is doing a lot worse than Ghana is. That economic aspect is really important, and it can drive people even from Western Togoland to think about staying as part of Ghana. I have here. This is from a professor in Ghana named I might screw this up, but Komla Jigbodi Ajjima. This person is a professor emeritus of geology in Ghana, but they're from Western Togoland, specifically that region, and I read their opinion on this matter from 2017, and he talks about the plebiscite, and he says, look, at the time, the plebiscite in that referendum established a country that called Ghana, and we, the peoples of present-day Volta region, were a part of that. And we were an integral part of the new country Ghana that was born in the 6th of March, 1957. He even says it in his thing, the proud first independent black African country. And he says, we are not added onto Ghana. We are an integral part of becoming Ghana itself, which I thought was really interesting. And then on top of that, he says, history also teaches us that secession has never worked for anybody's good. A really strong claim. And he says, look at Somalia, Northern Ireland, Eritrea, Kashmir, Kosovo, Ukraine, etc. Certainly, I don't think this is the kind of situation we want to plunge the Volta region in at this stage in our development. And so I thought that was super fascinating how he brought up other mentionings, and it's right. Like Northern Ireland, we talked about that is not as nearly of a good economic place as the Republic of Ireland. Kosovo is not necessarily a great economic place. South Sudan is not in any great economic place. Some of these political realities certainly matter as far as like what the next step is. And this person from West Togoland, who wants to remain part of Ghana, certainly thinks that it's not worth the trouble. It's just not worth the trouble to plunge yourself into violence and chaos when you're still you're still trying to even just develop for the first time. And I think I think it makes a lot of good points. Now, this is definitely an issue where I really don't have a personal strong opinion because I know so little. I don't know who quote unquote started the violence, right? Because I did see reports that there was road blockages in Western Togoland as part of this separatist movement. There's plenty of signs and protests put up like, you're now entering Western Togoland, the Togoland Restoration Project. This is a separate Togoland. I do know that some separatists were arrested by the Ghanese, they're the Ghanaian? I don't know how to really say that, but the police of Ghana have arrested separatist members, right? There's definitely like flare-ups of like protests, of violence, people burning tires, stuff like that. I think the biggest one that probably pissed a lot of people off is road closures. I mean, anytime you have protests in America that close roads, people get really upset. So, I just thought it was super interesting, though, that it was this man who's, a very learned and educated person who's from Western Togoland, basically just looked at history and was like, it's not worth it. Like, we are better off being a part of a peaceful and developing nation than we are to be alone in our own, economic strife.
No, it is interesting, and like this is just my theory after kind of looking at all these things, and actually our discussions with like Northern Ireland, Yugoslavia, things like that, is that I feel like places, like, there's almost a psychology to independence, which is like if you're a nation that has a region that is not doing well and feels isolated or maybe culturally different, it makes it very easy to kind of say, well, maybe we're better if we're separate. And sometimes it's warranted and other times it's not. And I feel like what you're saying is that it's an economically struggling part of Ghana, and there have been clashes with Ghana's law enforcement, Ghana's military, and with this Homeland Study Group Foundation, which sounds like the American Heritage Foundation or something. Like it's, but I'm just fascinated with this because like the bigger takeaway I actually take from this is that no one, especially in Western media, just really wants to cover any of this.
Yeah,
Like,
it's just not important to the West, even though, or at least on the news cycle. Um, yeah, it is strange. It was really hard to find in-depth analyses of this situation.
yeah, yeah, it is. And that's what kind of blows my mind is that if well, I mean, obviously, actually, a perfect example, the United Kingdom with Scotland, less violence. But it's a bigger deal to Westerners, and that's covered full heartedly in everything from BBC to CNN, Scottish independence. We seem to think that Africa was a set continent back when the Berlin Conference happened, and that's just not true. And I do really quick want to go back to Sudan for a second because think Sudan's example is almost kind of a warning for other African countries because I think Sudan was the biggest country in Africa. So the fact that it broke up, back when I think it was 2011, I believe, was when all this started. But USAID had a really good piece. It talked about how USAID, for people who don't know, that's kind of the US's humanitarian branch of the US government, deals with kind of orchestrating peace talks. And basically, kind of the one thing that I got out of this USAID report from October 2011 was that any big independence movement that is successful, they need a third party arbitrator. Like
Mm.
in the case of Sudan, it was the US government. And I think Obama's government did a good job of at least getting South Sudan separated from Sudan. Now, success, that's a whole other conversation. But
Yeah.
in terms of Ghana and Togoland, there's no third party arbitrator. It's either they start their own government or they clash with Ghana. So inevitably, I would say it's going to fail because it's almost like if you're divorcing your spouse, no, arbitrator or
Oh
divorce
yeah, there's
attorney.
no lawyer. Yeah.
Exactly. It's just a couple getting into spats and trying to figure it out. And South Sudan actually became somewhat of a SH hole country if we were using Trump's rhetoric here. I mean, their literacy rate is 27%, and they lacked skilled individuals to even run the government. And then they also had these warlords who were, I guess, isolated from Sudan, took up their own tensions once South Sudan came into power. And they killed several thousand people in less than a month. And it became a whole new ethnic war. Because I would argue, even though there was a third party, no one really asked any follow up questions. And I think that's kind of the big issue. And again, China has come into this. Again, China is now picking up the pieces. But again, the U.S. was sloppy in our foreign policy, and I think we're paying. And Togoland, I think, was probably going to go down the same route. I could imagine China gets involved, but not the United States, especially under Trump.
Well, yeah, I certainly hope that it doesn't get to the point of the violence we've seen in Sudan. But you're right
Probably
that
not.
it's like obviously the Sudan situation is like a warning to similar situations. And you're right that there's no big name arbitrator. Now there was this interesting organization that I found that represents this the Homeland Study Group Foundation. And it's the Unrepresented Nations and Peoples Organization, the UNPO, and they're interesting. They're not like technically a part of the UN. They're like an international organization. They're based out of the Netherlands. I think even right now they're headed by an American, Ralph J. Bunchy. Um, So it's like an international movement to like give a voice and give some representation on the world stage to peoples and nations that aren't officially recognized. So some of those that used to be part of the UNPO that are now recognized are Armenia, East Timor, Estonia, Latvia, Georgia, Palau. These are all now UN member nations that used to be at one point not considered a fully recognized nation and were under the UNPO. So today, Western Togoland is a member of the UNPO along with Catalonia, right? So Catalonia in Spain, the Iranian Kurds. So there's various groups that have an identity, have some kind of political movement that are not officially recognized on the world scale, that then this organization tries to represent them. And so, the UNPO claims that they care about, the equal right to self-determination, internationally accepted human rights, all that kind of stuff, right? Democratic pluralism, nonviolence. And it's interesting to see that they are supporting Western Togoland, and that's included in. So there is Guam, interesting, that's there. It is interesting to see that there is this organization that kind of tries to be the lawyer, so to speak, for these unrepresented nations. I think even in an American Indian nation was at one point on the UNPO. But it doesn't necessarily mean they'll have the success of Armenia, right?
Right, and I do like the idea of this. Don't get me wrong. And I know whenever you say "but," it it clearly goes against the first part. I just hear Catalonia and Togoland, and I think a lot of people are going to go, "Alex, you're crazy for like putting those into the same sentence," but they're the same thing. International community doesn't recognize them because international law just doesn't credit what they're doing. Like there is a big difference, I think, between Borneo. You were talking about Armenia. East what's the country?
Timor.
Near Guinea. Timor, sorry. Yeah, that was the one where the US was still a huge arbitrator in that issue after the Cold War. And Catalonia, they don't have any political standing in Spain. Kind of seen as a kind of fringe movement. And so I just I like the idea, but I think sometimes strength of our world right now is the fact that we have little pieces that are unified. And if we start allowing all these small little places to start picking out the details of what they want in their independence, it's going to be a slippery slope. And like that's why I think countries like Armenia, rightfully so, are granted independence because of a paper trail, of something that is a cultural paper trail of difference and statehood. I don't like Catalonia and Togoland, just to name a few examples, really don't give me a paper trail of a country that could do well independently.
Especially in the case of Western Togoland, when you literally had a referendum where people voted to be like help in joining Ghana. It's gonna be really hard. Like to me, it just seems like. To me, it doesn't seem like there was a strong cultural ties to this one land that then was like oppressed by an over group and they're fighting for their independence, right? This to me seems like, yes, like borders were drawn by Europeans at one time, but then there was that referendum to then, okay, well, let's see what the people want. Do you want to be an independent, or do you want to kind of form Ghana with some other groups? And they chose to form Ghana with some other groups, and like, I guess that I understand why maybe some people don't want to do that, but it doesn't have, like you said, it doesn't have that strong of a paper trail as something like in Armenia, or in my opinion, in Ireland or whatever,
or Yugoslavia.
Yeah. That's what I mean. So, it was just interesting to see because I had never even heard about this UNPO. And it was interesting to see, and it's interesting to see how much, like, how many different groups they try and represent, and they try and push into the UN and try and gain full independence, but only a select few have gotten that far.
Yeah, and the closing thing I'll say, which kind of just goes off what you were saying there, is that I think that's why I was talking about Catalonia and Togoland, or Western Togoland. is the fact that I think both of them early on subscribed to national borders, like a lot of Europe especially, and now they're kind of backtracking on this, but there's less of an actual significance or urgency. You know, it's kind of like with the times they've realized they'd prefer independence, and that's just not how the international order works.
Yeah.
And we need to remember that is that usually the urgency of allowing states statehood through independence, separatist movements, whatever that is, it's usually out of urgency. There's a difference between Armenia or Yugoslavia or, Eastern Germany following the end of the Cold War. There's differences.
Yeah, there are.
And we do need to remember that. And now I'm interested, and maybe we should do an episode on this, is this Native American land in the United States you were talking about. It's part of this UNPO.
I think
well.
It was part. I don't think it's currently. I think it's yeah, former members in dark gray. Let's see if I can find it here.
Yeah, I'd be curious just to know about that.
Yeah,
because that's I mean, like, this is a wormholes which let's not even get into right now, but that's something we could definitely do an episode in future time, is talking about like Native American land in the United States.
Oh,
like
absolutely. I'd love to. Look at this though. Yeah. I look at this. The District of Columbia. The DC statehood congressional delegation is a member of the UNPO because they feel they're unrepresented by the U.S. government. Tibet is on here. Taiwan. Yeah.
Taiwan and Tibet, definitely. I mean, DC is hard because you have the most money in Washington.
Right.
Like that's the weird thing, is Washington's actually like the most political finance part that has the most power, but also the citizens have the least. So that's
yeah. The actual residents of DC don't have as much. Anyway, that could be a whole nother thing itself. But super fascinating, super interesting, and again, we are absolutely not experts on this topic. It was just fascinating. I mean, we're educated in like geopolitics and international relations, but certainly I'm not any expert on Western Togoland and Ghana. So this was kind of eye-opening and cool to just kind of learn about what's going on in that part of the world for the first time. I encourage you, if you are interested, dig around some of these like local Ghanaian like YouTube videos. Like I found this one from Pulse Ghana, and it's Western Togoland declares independence from Ghana now. It only has like 12,000 views. It was just super fascinating to read the comments. To like, think about all those like Facebook debates you see about like Trump. But imagine it's about all these people that you've never heard of or never met about a topic that you've never heard of. Like, it's just funny to see how people get so invested in these things. And I'm like, wow, I'm learning about this for the first time. Super fascinating. I definitely think it's worth a look. And I really don't know what to feel about this particular situation. But from what I understand, I don't think that this is going to go the route of becoming a full-fledged, universally and internationally accepted nation. I have a feeling that this will just kind of die down, like it did the last time. Like it seems like every 8 or so years they declare independence and then nothing happens. So we'll see what we'll see. But I hope that was fascinating to you at home listening. It was certainly fascinating to Alex and I. You can catch all of our episodes at Podbean, Apple Podcasts, iTunes, YouTube. We do live stream these sessions most of the time at like 6 p.m. Pacific on Tuesdays. That's subject to change, but usually once a week we live stream these recording sessions and we talk about all sorts of stuff. So let us know your thoughts, and stay healthy, stay safe, and stay sane.